And within that carbohydrate insulin model, what role does the brain seem to play? It doesn't seem to play a very large role in that model, does it, as compared to the energy balance model?
Well, my friend Marc Friedman likes to say you have to keep in mind what's the shot and what's the echo. So in the energy balance model, the brain regulates fat accumulation, and it does it. And I may be oversimplifying, for which I'm going to apologize to people who listen to this and criticize me on Twitter. It does it by manipulating energy intake and expenditure. And ultimately, the difference between intake and expenditure that's determined ultimately by the brain is what then is stored as fat. And this alternative model says, look, the brain plays a role in fat accumulation. We've known that for nothing else, 150 years or so. I mean, but it doesn't do it by manipulating intake and expenditure directly. It does it by hormonal and central nervous system effects on fat storage and fat metabolism. In 1850 or so, Claude Bernard, the great French physiologist, punctured the third ventricle of the brains of rats and animals, probably dogs back then, and got them to dump glycogen from their liver into the bloodstream. The brain, we've known there were studies, observations in the first half of the 20th century of individuals who had spinal cord damage. And above the damage to the spinal cord, they'd be lean, and below it, they'd be obese. And so the researchers who studied fat metabolism realized that the central nervous system, the nervous system innervates fat cells. And it causes fat cells. You can stimulate nerves and it will cause fat cells to dump fat into the bloodstream. And if you inhibit this stimulation, then the fat cells will hold on to fat. So we've always known it plays a role directly in fat storage and fat metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism. There's a concept called intermediate metabolism, which is basically what your body does with all the macronutrients you consume between eating it and excreting it. And it stores them and converts them into one into another and uses them for different purposes. And that's all part of this intermediate metabolism. And the brain plays a significant role in that, but not by determining what you eat or exercise, how much you eat or how much you exercise, but through these central nervous system and hormonal influencers. And then whatever happens in the periphery can feed back to determine how much we eat and exercise. So for instance, if you're storing excess calories, those calories aren't available to be used for energy. And so you're going to expend less energy as a result. If one of the theories I didn't discuss in any of my books, because it was one level of complication more, is that the signal to the brain whether or not to eat is not necessarily these hormones that the metabolism of the research community has embraced, like leptin and ghrelin and MPYY, but it's actually responding to the energy status of liver cells. So the liver sort of serves as an energy sensor in the body. All the various macronutrients pass through the liver.
Yep.
And you need an organ that just as the eyes receive photons from the outside world and then transmit the information to your brain, which then creates pictures out of it. The idea is your liver receives information on basically the energy content of your body and sends signals to the brain whether or not you should eat or not eat. And this is a hypothesis. I did discuss the general nature of it in the last chapter of Good Calories, Bad Calories. But again, your brain is responding to your body. So if we disrupt your body in such a way, if we give you a drug that'll make your body store fat, like insulin, for instance, you will respond by getting hungrier because your body is trying to grow, just as when your kids go through puberty and go through growth spurts, though. One of the reasons you'll know what's happening is they'll be hungrier than they were before because their bodies are now trying to grow. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, Gary, if we look kind of 5, 10 years down the road, what does the evolution of research in this area around the carbohydrate insulin model?
Oh, again, this depends on funding availability. There are experiments that can be done. There's not a lot of interest by the NIH to fund this research. You get a different variation on it, which is, again, the implication of the carbohydrate insulin model is that carbohydrates are fattening. Okay, simple statement. And the fewer carbohydrates you eat, the less of an effect they will have on you. So the extreme is ketogenic diets, right? That's where you remove the carbs in the diet and replace them with dietary fat, because that's the one macronutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion. There's been an explosion in ketogenic diet experiments. They cannot
Absolutely.
establish, as they're typically done, what hypothesis of fat accumulation is being influenced here. There are ways to do it with ketogenic diets that we've tried to do in the past, that we've tried to fund with the not-for-profit I had co-founded. But those studies get funded. And probably in the neighborhood of 200 clinical trials that have now been done that are almost universally, the ketogenic diet turns out to be almost universally beneficial on almost any sort of physiological state that it's studied on. I'm skeptical of all that work, but it's pretty consistent and pretty compelling, and people are willing to accept that one implication of this is that ketogenic diets, keto, are healthy. Against that, you have this other force, which is the idea that animal agriculture is both unethical and, a major driver of climate change. So you have researchers and physicians and dietitians and nutritionists who are advocating more and more for ketogenic diets as the solution to many physiological conditions. And then you have the competing world of researchers and influencers and public health authorities arguing that ketogenic diets tend to be rich in animal products and they're bad for the environment. And we're all, nutcases. So it's hard to see where that'll play out. It's a constant day-to-day battle, and both sides think they're on the side of good science, which is fascinating. Both sides think in an ideal world, like I said, there would be some governing body of exceedingly good scientists who would come together and say, this is so important, let's figure out what experiments have to be done and what doesn't to figure out what's driving the obesity and diabetes epidemics. Because if it's people eating too much, that implies a whole world of different therapy and preventive measures. And if it's the quality and quantity of the carbohydrates people are eating. And so it has to be, I am still stunned that so little interest is generated by the funding organizations to solve this problem.